So in 2026, as America continues to collapse under a very inept and dangerous administration, we find the new American empire lashing out at its neighbors, trying to consolidate as much strategic resources as they can before those countries are able to actually decouple from the American economy. It's exactly what we're seeing with recent moves that the Trump administration is make towards backing separatists in Alberta, Canada. And the whole thing is being framed not as an invasion, but instead as a rescue mission. The fact is, the map that you grew up with in Canada is being redrawn in back offices in Washington, D.C. right now. Over the past couple of weeks, we heard US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent get up and say that there's great commonality between the people of Alberta and America and how we should let them come down. And this isn't something that was just captured on Twitter or in a back room. No, this is something that was said on national TV. The thing is, traditionally, America looked up north and saw the great country of Canada as a brother. But with trade policies changing, with trade relationships changing, and the old world order being dissolved in front of this administration's eyes, Canada is no longer seen as a brother to them. It's just simply seen as a liability, and a liability that needs to be dealt with in order for America to be secure in the future. So over the past year, this administration has met with a separatist group coming out of Canada several times. Most recently, the Financial Times reported a contingent of the leadership from that same party meeting with Trump officials in D.C. Now, back in June of 2025, there was reports of a negotiation of the U.S. government funding the separatist group with a $500 million loan. This is essentially a business loan, the kind of money that is. But that number has changed recently, and it looks like there might be negotiations for a $500 billion credit line coming from the US Treasury to this separatist group. Now, this seems like a bit of a crazy theory. I understand that this is happening. Now, $500 billion is a war chest. It's something that's meant to back a new currency, because the reality is what the separatists have seen before is that their bank accounts can get frozen. And they can essentially get financially punished by Ottawa. This would make it safe for them to actually operate and use the leverage of the U.S. government to actually push their demands forward and to be taken more seriously. This entire thing is really going under the radar in America right now. And I understand that the Canadians have more of an eye on what's happening between the relations with Canada and America right now. But you have the Premier of British Columbia getting up and calling these people who went down to D.C. and using the term treason to define their actions in moving against Canadian sovereignty. There's a bigger picture that's being painted that the public doesn't have access to see. And that's really what concerns me, especially in our relationships between our two countries, because they are so important, especially at this moment. Yes, Canada is looking to decouple from the United States, but America is dependent on Canada. And for the time being, Canada is dependent on America. So it's important that we have a close trade relationship and a close filial bond with each other, historically, like we've always had. Since Mark Carney gave his speech in Davos, and the day after that, Donald Trump coming out and calling him ungrateful, calling him the governor, really demeaning the prime minister and the responsibilities and role that Canada plays in the relationship, we've seen an acceleration, potentially in commitment, between the U.S. and the separatist groups coming out of Canada. The question is why? Now, why would America move to actually annex Alberta from Canada? Of course, this would cripple Canada because it essentially splits it in half and makes commerce domestic between the two sides basically impossible. They'd have to make it run through America, which means that any commerce between them would be subject to American tariffs that are being placed on Canada. But since Canada has moved to make negotiations with China and India, along with most of our allies at this point, have essentially moved on or already decoupled from America or making moves to do so at this moment, because the economies between Canada and America are so dependent on each other. If Canada were to actually decouple from the American economy, it wouldn't just be ruinous for the economy itself, but America at this time right now, and as we talked before about the lack of availability of potash in America, that's going to take between 2 and 10 years for those mines to actually be operable. Industry, manufacturing, and agriculture would basically go under if Canada chose for that to be so. And that doesn't take into account that most of the crude oil that comes into America is coming from Canada, more specifically from Alberta. And because we already have pipelines that are coming into America from that point, the acquisition or annexing of Alberta does play a key strategic interest to this administration, especially as they continue to move towards isolationism and push away all their allies. We need to consolidate these resources for America to remain operable and to remain a superpower in the Western Hemisphere. We've talked about the Monroe Doctrine coming back into existence, right? This is essentially what that is, but it's more on the line of manifest destiny. This administration doesn't actually believe in sovereignty. We can look at the moves that we're making on Cuba right now, effectively cutting off all fuel for a fuel-dependent country, which is leading to dire circumstances that the people are facing, putting pressure on them to actually take power back in their country. Of course, we know the actions that took place in Venezuela as well. And with the news of one of our closest historic allies, whether that be military or trade, the UK moving away from America into the arms of China, this administration feels more and more isolated and alone. It ran on isolationism, but the reality of isolationism is damning to the economy. So the only way for that to actually be possible is to take these resources. Confiscating tankers coming from Venezuela simply isn't enough. This administration sees a direct pipeline going into one of the third largest oil reserve in the world and says, we need that. It sounds silly to a lot of us, but it's a pragmatic move to an empire. And America is no longer a republic. Its behavior in every way is represented by the definition of empire, of empirical action. So Carney might have went to Davos with the best intentions and delivered a historic speech that might actually change the course of Western trade and commerce. But the truth is, he left Davos with a target on his back. Because like I said, this administration no longer looks up north at Canada and sees a brother, it sees it as a security risk. So let's go back to the $500 billion question, because I think that's one of the most important things that is really happening here. So how do you steal a province? Right? You don't do it with tanks, you do it with banks. With multiple reports of the separatists meeting with officials in Washington, D.C., the number that keeps coming up is $500 billion. Like I said, it isn't a $500 million business loan, right? This is more profound than that. Like I said, this is a war chest. This is actually enough money that mitigates any kind of financial risk that the separatists take on their shoulders, which gives them more leeway for extreme action in Canada for U.S. interest. Because one of the arguments for them going down there is saying, $500 million, that might be enough for a new pipeline. But the reality is $500 billion is more than you need for a pipeline. What you need $500 billion for is a change of ownership. And one of the theories behind this is that $500 billion is enough to back a new currency that would protect separatists long enough until they're able to start being backed by the US dollar. The hard truth is, if the US government is actually backing these people in Canada, who's going to arrest them? Is it the Royal Canadian Mounted Police against the US Treasury? I don't think so. If that happens and the government actually moves to arrest people in this separatist group or the officials that met with the Trump administration, America now has the permission slip to move in, because this administration has the motive, and that's the capture of the oil and protection from China. And they have the mechanism, of course, which is the ability to back these separatist groups. And this is where it kind of gets terrifying for anyone who's living above the 49th parallel. As Scott Bessent said, why invade when you can just invite them in? This is a new kind of doctrine. This is Bessent Doctrine. It essentially states that any threat to American resources or American security in another nation is subject to the involvement of American foreign policy and military involvement. If the economic freedom of America is threatened, then the U.S. has the right to move in with their military. Because when we look at this from a larger picture, the U.S. doesn't have allies anymore. The U.S. has assets and liabilities. Alberta is an asset. Ottawa is a liability. So the narrative that's being built in Washington, D.C. right now is fairly simple. Ottawa is a tyrannical globalist regime that is putting its people into hunger. It's freezing their resources that they've rightfully earned for political purposes. It's selling out its own people to China and threatening U.S. interest. Therefore, the U.S. has a moral obligation to step in to make sure that the Albertan people actually have the kind of freedom that they are promised. So the entire thing is being framed not as military adventurism or imperialism. It's being framed as America having a moral obligation to the separatists of Alberta. So in a way, Washington D.C. is kind of using Canada's history against itself here. They're pointing out the bank account freezes and the blocked pipelines and saying to the world, we're not going to annex a province. We're just granting asylum to a hostage. So if Mark Carney or anyone else tries to block the referendum, even if it doesn't have popular support enough to be passed in Alberta, then the U.S. steps in militarily to protect the democratic process. If you're watching this from the United States right now, you might actually be cheering this on. You say, well, we get more oil, that means that we get cheaper gas. I say to that, don't be naive. We in America right now are witnessing the expansion of an empire, and it gets more predatory day after day. And the government that eats its allies alive will eventually move to eat its subjects as its allies disappear, or they've expanded their reach as far as they possibly can. I noticed a lot of people from Canada saying that none of this is actually possible, but I promise you that anything's really possible, because there's nothing that's off the table when it comes to capturing resources to this administration. So if you do live in Canada, you are facing a kind of existential crisis and immediate danger coming from Washington, D.C. If Alberta actually walks, if America annexes them into the United States, maybe makes them the 51st state, well, they're going to take all that resource wealth with them, which is going to take the Canadian dollar, which is an up-and-coming fiat currency in the world right now, and it's essentially just going to turn into monopoly money. The Canadian dollar is backed by two things, really, and that's energy and real estate. And if energy walks, if the oil is taken by America, then the real estate bubble will burst. So while the US dollar is fading from global importance, it would essentially make the Canadian dollar obsolete as well. We saw the extreme rates and disagreement when it came to Canada. And Canada is a country that most Americans can't even find on the map. Canada, on the other hand, we know is the one above us. It's the best way we can put it, American education. But it's like I said at the beginning of this, Americans, we look at Canada as a brother of ours. Granted, we've always said it's our little brother, calm down. It is still part of the family. So to see the death of the Republic and the rise of the new American empire, and it moved to actually break the sovereignty of another country, really feels like a betrayal to ourselves and what we believed our country was or is supposed to be. Whatever this is now doesn't feel like America to most of us. We have troops on our streets. Any real idea of freedom is just slipping away from the American people. So we're not surprised when we hear this, but there's so much noise going on that it just doesn't seem important to us anymore, because all of our lives are individually being threatened right now as the dollar continues to plummet and as all of our trade partners walk away from us. And the fact that the president came out and said that home prices aren't going to come down, he's not going to let that happen, means that not only is Canada potentially on the slate as far as military action, but the very lives of most Americans, the future of American people here in the States as the individual, is threatened as well. Not just threatened, but is actively being. And it's a great shame because, I love my country. I served my country. And I know that there's millions, probably a couple 100 million Americans who feel the exact same way that I do. But at the same time, we feel that there's a great disconnection between us and our ability to actually say no. Because it doesn't matter what the polls say. It doesn't matter if the president has 8% approval rating to move on another country. They're still going to do everything that they can to do that as long as they have the support from the military. So the question is, what does the military do? Because Trump has done everything that he can to consolidate support and loyalty within the military, like getting rid of the officers and generals that he feels would actually not carry out what kind of orders he gives, no matter what they are. And the U.S. military, which is traditionally very conservative, is likely to follow those orders. So the thing is, it's just, if there's an opportunity for this administration to act, they're going to. Because the writing is on the wall and that America as a superpower is in great decline. So, like I said, it's consolidating all the geopolitical positions and strengths that it can before its power dwindles to the point where it can't actually move on those things. So, while you say America would never go after Alberta, it is going after Alberta. It's actively in negotiations with parties who are working against the sovereignty of Canada to annex Alberta into America. To take those resources, the third largest oil reserve in the world, away from the Canadian people, into the hands of American corporations. For a lot of us, it feels like the walls are kind of closing in on us, and I understand that. It feels like we are trapped here in America, or no matter where we go on Earth right now, that America is exercising its ability to reach out and challenge that place of peace. And I mean, that all goes back to Stephen Miller saying that, America is a superpower, and it's time that America starts acting like a superpower. And when that sentiment becomes the core philosophy of this administration, then America ceases to be a democratic republic, a constitutional republic, and simply becomes an oligarchy, monarchy, autarky, all the archies. But tell me what you think. Because this is a serious situation and these things are unfolding as we speak. But thanks as always. Thanks for stopping by. Food for thought.